Welcome to the Lebanon Museum Foundation presentation. And I think most of you have been to one before. Looks like I recognize most of you. So if you haven't, welcome. We have a great talk tonight on Civil War medicine. And in a couple of weeks, I think it was a couple of weeks, is going to be the reenactment out at Cheetah Lake. So it's kind of a great timing for that. If you're not familiar with the museum, we started in 2018. We're incorporated as a 501c3, so we're a nonprofit organization. We are still desperately looking for a building, and things are coming together, but we're still looking. We're gathering funds for it. We're also looking for a place to store our collection. We have a growing collection. The collection is just amazing. We've got some really cool stuff. We have a saddle from a World War I veteran from Lebanon. We have the from the one butter company here, the family that had one of the butter companies. We got butter wrappers and shelves and just all kinds of really neat stuff. So we do need a place to display it. In the meantime, if you haven't been, the Wayne County Arts Guild, we have a display in there. It's got photos and some brochures and other information. So if you want to take somebody by there, that's kind of our little outpost that we have right now. So that's great. We have a little donation box up here, so if you feel like you want to give a buck or two, we appreciate it. We're doing this as a free service to the community. We love doing these, and we'll be having more talks this year. We're looking at a train talk, talking about the Santa Maria 205, which we have a steam engine. And so we've got a lot of really exciting stuff planned, and we don't have it all set yet, but we will be announcing. If you haven't checked it out, we have a Facebook page online, and we also have a website online, so you can also check them and see what we're doing. Tonight, I'd like to present Keith Menk and Ashley Wendell. Is it Wendell? Wendell. And they are going to talk about Civil War medicine. They got some really cool stuff up here, so I'm going to let them have it and take it away.
Well, I know Ashley and I are both really appreciate being invited to give this talk. And on behalf of the Northwest Civil War Council, I'd like to say thank you to the city of Lebanon for their support on our ongoing living history reenactments that we do here. Without the support of the city and other organizations, it wouldn't be as successful as it is. And as mentioned, we do have one coming up, May 18th and 19th. It's at Cheetah Lake. And so if you're interested, there are some flyers over there on the table. Ashley and I just took over medical demonstration when we do these living history reenactments. And there's so much information that we could go over because it was the Civil War and what was taking place in America at the time that revolutionized medicine, not only in the US, but also worldwide, and how they cared for the number of casualties that they got, how they treated folks, and how they established taking care of people long term. And so it's quite remarkable. And we'll start with a little bit to give you kind of a sense of it. With Manassas or Bull Run, which was the first battle, the amount of casualties coming out of that was not expected. Everyone thought it was going to be a short war, quick, be over. They were overwhelmed with the casualties, both north and south. And there wasn't a system in place really to deal with them effectively. At the start of the Civil War, the Union had approximately 90 doctors total. And by 1865, they had almost 2,300. They just significant as they built it up to deal with the casualties. Antietam, which was the major battle, knowing it was coming, they appointed Dr. Letterman to kind of put a system of care together. So he put a system in place with the idea of trying to get all casualties off the battlefield within 24 hours. And so did the system work? They had to have ambulances, they had to have people dealing with the ambulances, they had to have aid stations, field hospitals or division hospitals, and then regular hospitals in order to care for folks, how to get them off the field, how to get medicine to them. So that was the first major battle where they were testing his system. They had 23,000 casualties at Antietam, and it took basically 6 hours. Now, to keep that in mind is the population of Lebanon in 2024 is 20,000. So it's like, in 6 hours, you had more people than you have living in Lebanon right at the moment that were casualties. Did the system work? It did and it didn't. What it pointed out is what they needed to improve upon. And so, you could tell that he was happy that it was starting to work. And so what they did then is one of the things is getting medicine. Military, everything was by wagons at that point. Military controlled the wagons, so medicine didn't necessarily get to the right places, but ammunition did. And so Dr. Letterman got the ambulance corps basically out from the military under medical services. And it was, and we'll talk a little bit later about the Christian Commission and the Sanitary Commission, where they raised money and got supplies that were supplementing what the military was doing. And this was in the north. South didn't quite have those same sort of organizations with it. At Gettysburg, in 3 days, they had 53,000 casualties. Now, casualties were, dead but injured, where they weren't able to fight. And so imagine the system they put in place. So one of the systems was, and we represent this when we do reenactment, the medical is, we're like an aid station. Modern times, we'd be the ambulance crew. And we'd be so close to the battlefield that they would try and tuck aid stations behind big rocks, behind trees, because they were so close to the battlefield. And what we did, what we call today is triage. We would deal with the people we could fix and get back, and people that were going to take more care had to wait. Because it was to get the Army back on the field as much as possible. If not, then we sent them to a field hospital that could be 5 miles or so behind the lines, where they would tend to do the more serious medical amputations, things along those lines. If they got transferred from a field hospital to a general hospital, that's where the long care took place. So at Gettysburg, many of the casualties stayed in field hospitals at Gettysburg until Lincoln's address there. And that's the time that the field hospital there closed down and they were able to transport folks to general hospitals. So that was the system. Aid stations to division hospitals or field hospitals and then to general hospitals. And they were pretty close as the war went on getting all casualties off the battlefield within 24 hours. Because they knew the success of saving the soldiers increased dramatically the faster they got them off the battlefield. Anything you want to add to that at this point? Okay, all right.
Oh wait, one quick thing.
Yes.
We mentioned we were really close to the battlefield. As a aid station, we were within 50 to 100 yards. So we were also often in times of danger as we shifted those troops either back or out of that area.
71% of all gunshot wounds were to the extremities. Now they considered at that time when you're in an aid station, you were to try and get the soldier back. So if someone came in with a flesh wound and you could bandage them up, get them back to the field, that's what you did. They considered a wound to the head, the chest, or the abdomen fatal. So they would give them something to be comfortable. And then they'd let them sit while they dealt with the least severe of the injured. If there was an extremity, often, if it was other than a superficial, it meant an amputation. Aid stations did not do amputations unless the field hospitals were overwhelmed. And basically this kit here, you can take a look at it a little bit later, is a replica of the doctor's kit that they had. This is the type of saw that they used for amputations. They got scalpels. They got, if they were amputating something smaller, they'd have a smaller saw. And so basically that is true. They could do an amputation in 6 minutes. The survival rate of an amputation at that time was 75%, which is as good as it is now in modern medicine. So that's how proficient they were getting. The difficulty is that one, they didn't understand or believe in germ theory. Germ theory was established and acknowledged in Europe in the 1840s, late 1840s. But in the US, the doctors didn't accept that. They didn't think something was. So often, what they would do when they were amputating, they might have a wood handle on the saw. They might just wipe it on their pants leg, on their aprons. There was no sanitation. So often then, they'd survive the amputation, but later on, they might get an infection, gangrene, and they might die because of the result of that. Most of the deaths, 225,000 of the deaths in the Union was to disease, not battlefield injuries. So you have to keep in mind, some of these armies were 60, 65,000. Towards the end of the war, Grant probably had 100,000 or more, and that's not counting Lee's armies or in the Southern armies. Army regulations said you had to bathe at least once a month if water was adequate. And, so often, they weren't washing their uniforms. They were sleeping 6 men to a small tent or on the ground, even in the rain. The food that they got was not great. So they were very susceptible to diseases. Dysentery and diarrhea were the main killers of soldiers related to disease. But there was smallpox, cholera, malaria, any number of different diseases at that time. Vaccines were just becoming popular for, I think it was smallpox. And that they were learning from Europe and some slaves, actually, where they would take a person that had smallpox and blisters and take some of it and put it on another person. And they found that to be quite effective. What they did in treating, though, is any number of, there's a lot of home remedies. Blue moss was often used, and blue moss had a little bit of mercury in it, and a little bit of morphine. Morphine and opium were legal, and it was often mixed with alcohol. Anyone could get it. So the addiction rate, not only with soldiers, but with the general population, was extremely high, because that's what they used to treat any number of different things. Blue moss was used at times for diarrhea, but also for constipation. Never quite figured that one out. And they thought that Lincoln at one time or another was using blue moss. They also used it for sexually transmitted diseases, a variety of different things. But it was a little bit of mercury on a constant that was basically at times poisoning people. But they believed that it provided some temporary relief. And if someone came in who was injured, let's say with a gut shot wound or something, they would make them comfortable, give them some morphine, and try and take the pain away as much as possible. And so after the war, at least 1/3 of all soldiers in soldiers' homes died from sexually transmitted diseases, but most of them also, they had a lot of addiction issues. And we'll talk a little bit later about soldiers' heart, which was their version of PTSD, and the impact of that with soldiers coming out of the Civil War. A lot of firsts took place. The Union Army was the first to use trains to move wounded soldiers. South didn't necessarily have that convenience as much as the North did, just because the North had a system of railroads, had a lot more railroads, and the South had different gauges at times and didn't rely as much on rails for their commerce. And so the Union was the first, and the U.S. was the first to use trains to move wounded soldiers. They were also the first to use hospital ships. They created a couple hospital ships to deal with wounded sailors. And actually found out when they brought nurses on board that the survival rate of injured on hospital ships improved because of the cleanliness that they kept it. Want to talk about nursing?
Ah, nursing. So when the American Civil War broke out, we had 0 nursing schools in the United States. It was not a profession yet to the degree it is today. Most people, I believe, are very familiar with Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War. A lot of her documentation and experiments and eyewitness reports really formed nursing. Nightingale's information then trickled over to the United States, where a few other of us compiled it and later would open nursing schools and develop that profession to what we know today. So, nursing in the Civil War was led by Superintendent Dorothea Dix. She was known to be very strict. She wanted homely women that could multitask, that could present themselves in a clean manner, that were pious, of good moral character, and that could learn quick. We were told to show up when the volunteer call went out. Thousands of women responded. They were told to bring a sturdy pair of boots and wear a plain work dress. Browns, blacks, and grays were strongly encouraged. The white apron was something that was easy for us to clean and tell when it was dirty. Dorothea Dix did a few other things, though. Besides just being superintendent of nursing, she also created the first generation of American mental asylums. She was a big proponent of developing mental health and leading the charge here in the United States. And she really liked to challenge the current standards that had a lot of those mental health patients just in prison and not getting the treatment or help they deserved. Another big name in the Civil War is Clara Barton. You guys are probably familiar with her name. She was really good at self-promotion. She also founded the American Red Cross. And she was really good during the American Civil War at procuring supplies. A lot of the nurses, half the time they were caring for wounded, and half the time they were out searching for extra supplies. There's a lot of accounts of nurses going, ooh, there's chickens, can I have some eggs? Our soldiers need food. Ooh, there's a garden, let's grab this. Okay, we know battle's gonna be at this rough area. We're gonna set up an aid station here. We're gonna set up a basic hospital there, and the general's all the way back there. So what building can I commandeer to be the hospital? Schools, Grange halls, other public buildings quickly became commandeered and assembled by nurses for use for soldiers that were going to follow. Sophia Buckland was another nurse with a lot of information to share. She was also the first nurse in the field hospital at Gettysburg. Mary Bickendike is the first one to be called Mother. Mother was a term of endearment from the men that they would call the nurses because they received the love, patience, and kindness that only a mother could give. Nursing back then was not really a profession at all. So the original term of nurse would have been a wounded soldier that was less wounded than the others that was able to help. That status nursing quickly then became reassigned to a hospital steward, and they would also assist us. So you would have doctors, hospital stewards, and nurses in the buildings. Is anybody familiar with the author Alcott, Louisa May Alcott? She also served as a nurse. She wrote a series of sketches that were published in an article under an alias called Hospital Sketches. She wrote under an alias because women giving care of men outside their families was considered unbecoming. So a lot of nurses would go home and get ostracized for taking care of the wounded while being praised for their efforts that they contributed.
This is especially true in the South.
So as a nurse, a few of the tools we would bring to the table would be a notebook and pen, or pencil, I should say. Pens weren't exactly, fountain ink, but not the traditional pens you think today, so pencils were quicker to grab. We could write final letters for dying soldiers, we could take notes, and a lot of nurses ended up recording who they took care of and whether or not they made it. Thanks to their memoirs, their diaries, and their notes, we were able to later identify thousands of unmarked graves and get them marked so their families could remember them. We would also have a very early form of a stethoscope. We could use this to listen to a chest, monitor for heart rate. Today, these are still used often by midwives to listen to babies in utero. We would assist the doctors. He could give a request for chloroform or ether if we need to anesthetize a patient. We could then use a funnel to place over the patient's mouth, drop a couple of the preferred drug in the funnel, and let them inhale. We could then monitor the patient throughout the procedure, which is why our procedure rates were so successful. We would also make bandages. Keith already mentioned the Sanitary Commission and Christian Commission. They would fundraise, they would also make bandages, they would help pass out sanitary items. We would also do something called making lint, so we could stuff the wounds. This is literally just the shredded up bandages. And everything was reused. So we would cut sheets into bandages, we would use the bandages, we would maybe wash the bandages, and then we'd reuse the bandages. And I do mean we would maybe wash, because sadly we didn't understand germ theory. Some of the other developments that happened was horsehair. The doctors would frequently use horsehair to stitch wounds closed. Horsehair, to be long enough to stitch wounds closed, usually comes from the tail, not exactly the most sanitary part of the horse. So somewhere along the lines, we decided that, if we washed the horsehair first and boiled it for a few minutes, those wounds were less likely to get infected, and the horsehair was more pliable and easier to tie a knot without it brittly breaking.
And that really came from the South, because with the blockade, it was hard for them to get silk. And it was rough, so they tended to boil it to soften it. And then they realized after a while that, oh, by doing this, we're seeing less infections, because when you use silk to sew, the doctors would sew with silk. Well, it's porous. If they had extra silk, next guy came in, they'd sew him up with the same. Next guy come in, sew them up with the same thing. So they would just pass germs from one person to another without necessarily realizing it. And I want to go back to this. A myth of the Civil War, even World War I, is that a lot of the operations took place without the person being put under. You know, it's bite the bullet, bite the stick, bite the piece of leather. Out of the 90,000 surgeries done by the Union Army, only 236 were done without anesthesia. And the South basically was just as successful at producing chloroform and ether. In fact, they were the first government drug labs, both in the North and South, because they needed it and they used it. And so the myth of soldiers not having to go through an amputation without being put under is just a myth. It's Hollywood.
This, of course, also led to the question of nurse anesthetists in modern day medicine.
So kind of passing on, they had a term for pus, laudable pus.
We didn't bring any of that.
No, we didn't. No,
Thank
no.
goodness.
Yeah. So laudable pus in their terms was good pus. So they would look at two people. One was getting from an injury, seemed to be healing, but had pus, and one next to him had pus but wasn't. Well, they figured then that was the good pus. This wasn't, so they take the good pus and put it over on the other patient, hoping that it would transfer. In fact, some doctors tried to determine whether it was good pus by tasting it.
Oh.
This is where they were. There were some fantastic advancements in medicine, but there was some stuff that was backward. So for instance, in the person that I portrayed, I went to Rush College in Chicago for my medical training. That was like 6 months of classes. And then I might go out and work in a doctor's office, not with gunshot wounds or anything like this. In Minnesota, it was maybe a broken leg. Maybe it was a disease. Maybe it was, who knows what it was. They were on the border, the frontier, but they didn't have any experience. The next part was to go back again and take those same 6 months of classes over the next year. And if I completed that, then I was deemed a doctor. And so you had to go to Europe to start getting into serious things like surgeries and things like this. And there were some doctors that did. But most of the doctors that came in basically were just junior doctors. They learned from somebody they worked with, And basically, it was not very scientific. So one of the first things that Dr. Lebanon also did is realize that there are some people that shouldn't be practicing. And they were afraid that they were doing too many amputations. So that's where they moved amputations from aid stations to field hospitals, and they actually started a certification process. And if you didn't meet the certification, then you were no longer. And so that's another first that was coming out of the Civil War, is certification.
Is that where the term practicing came from?
Yeah, and surprisingly, dentists were probably more skilled at that time in medical care than medical doctors. Now, you had to have anywhere from 4 to 6 front teeth to be a soldier, because you had to be able to bite off the cartridge. Someone told me once time that's where the term 4F came from, because he didn't have 4 teeth, and he couldn't serve. You could join the Army, but you'd be dealing with mules, wagons. You could be, you know, an ambulance driver, something like this. The Confederacy, those prized dentists, because they made the connection between teeth and health. And so a lot of the Confederate armies had dentists, but the Union didn't necessarily. That's one of the differences between the two. And the Confederate Army didn't have the total number of doctors, basically, that the Union did. They had far fewer. And in many cases, their logistics, or let's say their ambulances, didn't have springs. One of the things that Letterman realized is those old wood wagons just were not great for carrying people who were injured to hospitals. So he developed a design, or got a design for an ambulance that had springs. The Confederacy never got to that level of their ambulances. They were still rigid. And so it was just a difference in resources and just trying to deal with. So those are some of the differences between the Union and the Confederacy. You want to talk about drugs?
Oh, we talked about drugs.
Some of the things that they did, to give you an idea, they used turpentine to discourage maggots and mixed it with castor oil to deal with diarrhea. And then laudanum. Laudanum you could buy. Laudanum was basically alcohol and morphine. And you could get it, and doses were different because whoever was putting it together had their own recipe. You know, it could have been grandpa's recipe, mama's recipe, I'm making that up. But you could go into a store, and it was used to treat a wide range of different things. And so at the end of the war, when they would had treating folks that had injuries, there's a term called soldier's joy, which was a mixture of opium and morphine and alcohol.
Oh, boy.
And so a lot of individuals basically had serious addiction issues coming out of the war. Not only the soldiers, but the general population, because it was readily available. It didn't matter if you were on the frontier or in big cities. You could go into a store and you could get opium pills, okay. Morphine. This is just their main painkillers that they used at the time. And so they really tried to keep injured soldiers basically comfortable, especially, again, head, chest, abdomen. They considered it fatal. They did not have the medical care nor the time to go in. And the reason that they did an awful lot of amputations is, and I can pass these around, these are the mini balls that they basically used. Mini. Menet, a Frenchman, developed them. This is another version. You can pass them around. And this is just a lead ball. It's soft lead. So when you were hit with that soft lead at low velocity would just expand out and break up, and if it went through, it would just shatter your bones. You'd have to have the best orthopedic surgeon today to try and reconstruct your bones in your legs if you were hit with one of those. So the only thing that they could do was amputate. And they could do it in 6 minutes. And like I said, the survival rate was 75%. That doesn't mean that they didn't get gangrene or infection later on with it. Because again, hospitals were also not recognizing sanitation until many nurses came in and opened up windows, and they realized that the battlefield, when they went into barns, they'd just take the animals out. Or at the house, you know, floors, there wasn't air going through. So they started developing hospitals that were tents. So Camp Letterman at Gettysburg, which was the Union one, was a huge complex of tents, like almost in a wagon wheel sort of situation that dealt with the wounded that were coming from the aid stations and that were too serious to be transported to a general hospital. So they had to wait until they recovered enough that they could move them to a general hospital. And they were huge, but once they figured out the tents, air, cleanliness, then the survival rates started going up and changed how they looked at dealing with, one, nurses, because they weren't necessarily well received in hospitals when they first came, and also, two, vocations and how they treated. Other strange drugs, malaria. They did not know that mosquitoes caused malaria. They thought malaria was due to bad air. And so they would treat it with a wide range of different things. Although they did find out at some point that quinine worked and lessened some of the symptoms. But they still didn't connect it that the mosquito was the cause of it. And so they were sort of behind on understanding a number of different things. All their tools were wood handles. They didn't sterilize their tools. You know, they might wipe them off. The doctors at a battlefield, I'd say at a field hospital, would spend lots of hours doing amputations. So one of the things that we talk about is a number 11. The doctors were entitled to some number 11 after so many hours of doing operations. And what number 11 is whiskey. And the reason it was numbered is that most of the soldiers could not read or write. And all the drugs were in Latin. And so if the doctors needed something, like more number 11, all they had to do was tell a runner to go over there and get number 11, or to get number 23, or to get whatever the number was, they could remember that. And so everything was kept, as far as drugs, by the number. And they kept meticulous, doctors did, information, largely due to nursing, the injuries. So if you go to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, they have a listing of the War of the Rebellion. And they have listed almost every operation, the soldier, what happened, their condition, what their treatment was. It was one of the most complete medical records of all of the casualties on the Union side. Now, the Confederacy probably is doing something similar. However, most of their records were lost in when Richmond burned. And so they don't necessarily have that. So we had a family member that died in the siege of Atlanta. We were able to go through a variety of different sources and get source documents that told us the date, what type of wound, where in the battlefield he was injured, how long he survived. It was a head wound. How long he survived, where he was originally buried, where they dug him up, and then where they reburied him. And it was just all of this. And we had copies of the documents that they used to record this. It was just fascinating that they kept that type. And I believe it was a nurse that really started that type of record keeping and making it that meticulous. Any questions so far?
Syringes. Did they have glass syringes? What did they use for injections?
We would have had metal and glass vials with a needle. They were kind of a newer development. As with most wars or any war, they really do push developments, right? So syringes would have been one of the things that improved. After we figured out sanitation, we would have replaced the wood handles with stainless steel. Most of these instruments are still used today, including this wrench for removing molars and teeth, and the doctor's favorite tonsil extractor.
Yeah, it's fine. Wanna see how it
They're still
works?
used today.
Yeah.
The cone we used for things like chloroform and ether later became, and I believe it was actually a Confederate invention, a small matchbox with a set of prongs with a sliding lid. And in that sliding lid, you could stick your rag to put your meds on. You could then close the lid and stick the prongs to your patient's nose. Then only they were inhaling it instead of it evaporating away and around and potentially getting to other people around them.
Like surgeons.
And that later became the nasal cannula people use for oxygen supply today.
So this is a tonsil remover. There's still something like this is still used. You would go in and put the tonsil and capture it here, and then you would push that, and that would hold the tonsil in place, right? And then you cut it out. I would have kept my finger in there, but and this actually with a chest wound or this would actually go into, they'd use this to go into the side of the chest. And then they could pull this out and drain the chest. So there's just a variety of different instruments here. A lot of them were designed to take bullets out. They had different sizes, different ones. But the most preferred one at times is just fingers. And, you know, they'd have one patient, they'd be digging around, trying to get the thing out. They would wipe it on their apron. Next person would come through, they'd just start going again. And so this is why so much of the disease and infection. They didn't call it infection, they called it inflammation.
They were half right.
So they just, a lot of home remedies. They believed to be true. They started discarding the mercury-related ones later in the war because they were beginning to believe that it didn't work.
Also, because he mentioned the doctors weren't always very well trained, the nurses had no training. It was a lot of those home remedies such as, hey, you have a fever, let's use a cold cloth in your forehead. Hey, your foot is swollen, let's elevate it. Oh, you haven't been turned lately, you're developing a cough, let's turn you onto your side, let's get you up and moving, and other things like that that they would like. Let's treat each individual symptom, not the disease in its entirety. Where in today's medicine, we treat the disease, and we hope the symptoms disappear with it.
But they talked about 225,000 Union soldiers dying from diseases. They don't count the ones that went home and then died from the diseases once they were home after the war. And that just is, you don't know. And then you're dealing with the mental health issues of soldiers going through what they went through. And so that's where we get into the soldier's heart. They did not understand basically what we call PTSD. I mean, in the First World War was shell shock, World War II was combat fatigue. In the Civil War, they called it soldier's heart. And at first it could be messed up. A person could have malaise. It was their first one, they were just low key. Often they treated it at 6 called number 11. So a lot of soldiers who wanted number 11 would come to sick call and say, I'm low energy, something along those lines, and they might get whiskey. It was used as a stimulant. The next one was melancholy. And a lot of times as these symptoms were developing, they thought that the soldier, because most of them were 19 to 21, some were younger. This young lad that this book is based on was 15 when he joined the 1st Minnesota. And so they thought, well, they're just homesick. They just want to go home. They don't want to fight anymore, they just want to go home. So what they did was they discipline them, or they make them work harder, or something to kind of basically get him to behave. But what Soldier's Heart was basically is his symptoms that were very similar to anxiety, panic attacks, rapid heartbeat, sweating, a variety of different things. And that's where they discovered that they had heart issues related to that condition. But they didn't demonstrate anything other physically. There was no wounds, there was nothing. So this is where some of the mental health and the starting of the mental health hospitals, they started moving those soldiers out because they were incapacitated, they couldn't fight. The issue though later was some of them, as veterans sometimes do, self-medicated, either with alcohol or with opium, other drugs, a variety of things, and the suicide rate was high. They had no numbers, but if you read a lot of accounts of ex-soldiers coming after what they had dealt with, they talked about those suicidal tendencies. And it just wasn't recognized. And so it was called Soldier's Heart. And some of it was, and they ended up going to mental hospitals to deal with the issues that they had suffered.
But most of them just went back home to their prior occupations.
So we had an Irish in our family, an Irishman that served in the Union Army. And after the war, the whole family just said he took the liquor. And they just thought, well, he took the liquor. They didn't connect it to his time in the Civil War. But looking back, now you wonder if his experiences in the Civil War, he was self-medicating because of the issues that he dealt with. Gives you a real different perspective then of how to look at someone like that, rather than just someone who took the liquor, took to the bottle. Any questions at this point?
Can we talk about the lake?
Yeah, Ernest. Okay, we're part of the 1st Minnesota, and I have to say, I got involved in this is because I used to just go watch the reenactments, because I'm a history buff, right? So I went one time and I saw a sign for the 1st Minnesota recruiting. Well, I grew up in Minnesota, and my first thought was, what? This is Oregon. And growing up, they didn't tell us about the 1st Minnesota in history. We talked more about the Sioux Uprising and things like this. So I went and talked to the folks, and they talked me into giving it a try, and now 9 years later, I'm still doing it. Well,
Gotcha.
we're part of the 1st Minnesota. That's who we represent. Well, this is, we said, the original doctor said it was George's leg. And the dad joke is George came in and said, Doc, save my leg, so they did. But we decided to rename him as Ernest Jefferson, Ernest Lake, because there was a real life soldier, Ernest Jefferson, in the 1st Minnesota, second day of Gettysburg. If you don't know the Battle of Gettysburg, the second day, the Confederates were coming through up in a gap in the Union line caused by Sickles and what he did. And there, depending upon the historian, there was 6-1. Hancock went to this regiment that started off as 1,000 at the beginning of the war. They were the first regiment committed to Lincoln, even before Lincoln asked for any by the Minnesota governor. They were down to about 236 by the time Gettysburg came. He came up and said, who are you guys first men? You got to take those flags. So the 236 went down on a charge towards Plum Run, is what it was called, against the Alabama groups. Some historians say the odds were 6-1, 4-1, who knows. But in about 15 minutes, they stopped it. Hancock got some more in, plugged the gap, and basically it didn't go any further. But in those 15 minutes, they went from like 236 to 46. Ernest was one of them. He got shot in the leg. His corporal took him off the field. And so when he got to the field hospital, they amputated his leg, but what they noticed was, remarkably, that the lead bullet, normally when it goes into the body, it flattens out, and if it touches any bone, it just shatters the bone. It went right through the bone. Didn't touch the bones at all. Just went a clean shot. They had never seen anything like that before. So they decided they'd preserve the leg, so they preserved it. Sent it to the Smithsonian after the war. Ernest didn't have a leg. Ernest survived, was discharged. He and his brother were instrumental in the establishment of Duluth, Minnesota. If you've ever heard of Duluth. In fact, their major downtown area, Ernest actually owned that land at one point. He did a lot of different things. But I came across that story of Ernest, and actually after the war, he went to the Smithsonian and wanted to see his leg. And they wouldn't let him touch it because the general public was not allowed to touch artifacts. So he threatened to sue him because you took my leg without my permission. So after much to do, as my wife's grandma would say, after he told them how the war ate the cabbage, they decided it was okay and he was able to touch his leg. I'm still assuming it's in the Smithsonian. I don't know for certain. But that was such a remarkable story that we decided to name the leg Ernest in honor of Ernest Jefferson. What we use this leg for is like school days, and when we're not doing the demonstration after the battle, we'll put a spent bullet in this wound. And there'll be fake blood, and so it's wet, squishy, and looks kind of gross, right? Just perfect for kids. And so we talk in terms of this instrument is a probe, and it would be porcelain white. So often what doctors would do, and they did this with Lincoln after he was shot, is they would probe around in the wound with this. And if it came out with gray on the end, they knew that they had found the bullet. But most of the time they just, and then they would go in with this and would go in to take the spent mini ball out, or the lead ball. Well, most of the time they just dispensed with this. And so then they would use their fingers, they would go in and they would feel around till they found it, and either then able to pull it out with that utensil or would just use their fingers. So the kids enjoy searching for the bullet in this. Not so much the parents, but the kids do. And the fake blood is just dish soap and red dye. So then they can just watch their fingers. So but we can talk about that whole process.
Kind of a morbid question, but you did mention, and I was thinking about it before you even mentioned the leg going back to the Smithsonian. Well, what did they do with the extremities? Did they just bury them after they amputated?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There would be piles upon piles of dead and or limbs. Morbidly speaking, there are actually a couple occasions where it is recorded as being frigid temperatures, and they would start stacking the piles and or the bodies around the surgeon's tent to help keep them warm so they could keep performing those surgeries because their hands were freezing.
Any other questions? Yes?
Only vaguely related. Have you taken one of the Stop the Bleed classes?
Yes.
So they do a similar exercise where they have a leg with a big hole in it, and you're supposed to put your fingers in there and feel around and pack the wound. And we all kind of, ew, but, you know.
So what we do, if you come to the event, public service announcement. If you come to the event on the 18th and 19th at 12:30, we do a medical demonstration. We have this, but we have a table. And so what we do is we get 3, sometimes 4 soldiers that will put together fake wounds. A stake in a leg, a bullet in their leg, gunshot wound to the stomach sort of thing, a fractured hand. There was one doctor would come out in one of our battles up in Astoria. It was nationally known. He did things like an amputation. I had my leg amputated. And then one time he did brain surgery on me because I had a swelling in my brain, so he drilled in. It's a little bit of theater when you're doing this. But he had this stuff to make the wounds look really good. We're not quite that sophisticated yet at this point.
Not yet.
But we put them on the people on the table, and then we talk, we deal with it. You know, we talk about the maggots in the wound, and there's maggots in the wound. We talk about a variety of different things. So that gives us an opportunity to kind of demonstrate putting them under, checking their heart rate, limp, bandaging things up. sending them to the field hospital because we can't deal with it. We've done an arterial bleed in the leg, so then we can talk about a tourniquet and putting it on, not tight, but, and then basically getting them off the table and the next person comes. And so it gives us a little time to demonstrate. And it's great if we have kids up front because the sound effects really draws the adults in.
And one more. So you were mentioning the triage, and that sounds really familiar from like the TV show MASH, which was the Korean War. So is it still similar system even today?
Yeah, Dr. Letterman's system basically established care in the battlefield and the whole process. So it made it over into Europe. First World War started following this, made it to Korean War. It's basically what you see the US Army using in modern warfare, is how they deal with this. This is why it was revolutionizing medicine, care of wounded and casualties in war. And even though they started off without much knowledge, like germs or things like this, the system that Letterman put in place, quite remarkably, is just improved upon and became the basis and foundation. So yeah, MASH is a good example of that.
But you are right in saying it seems backwards, because if you were to go down to the local ER, a small flesh wound is going to wait until the heart attack and all the other things are taken care of first. Because in modern medicine, we have those things to take care of those critical cases so they don't die. Where back then, we had to take care of these simple cases to get them out to the field, because if you were gonna die, we'll keep you comfortable, but you're gonna die. But if you're still alive when I'm done with all these simple cases, I'll come back and see if I can actually help you. Because we only had so many people and resources to allot per time and section in place.
And remember, the battles had a purpose. So sometimes the wounded soldier would take two people off the battlefield. The wounded soldier and the person taking them back to the field hospital. And so keeping people on the battlefield to fight was the most important thing. And that's unfortunately the way the system was set up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that triage comes from the French verb trier, which means to sort. So it's just a sorting. It comes from French.
Anything else? I think we have 6 minutes. Now, if you want to come up and take a look at, if
What
there's no
about
other
tourniquets?
questions.
Were they using, was use of tourniquets established in?
Yes, yes. And so like when we did the arterial bleed at as our demonstration, basically, it was our way of saying, let's put a tourniquet on. Because it was a way to save the life, even though once the tourniquet went on, they were guaranteed to lose a leg. Because if we didn't, we sent them to the field hospital, they would have bled out. So they did, yes.
So they never dealt with infection through the war to speak of? They just didn't understand it?
They didn't believe in germ theory. Europe did, but the U.S. was 20 years behind accepting that. Now, as they got into the war, I think it was like in 1870 something, it finally became part of U.S. medical knowledge that germs caused problems. So that was even 10 years after. But they noticed things like horsehair, less infections rather than silk, because silk was porous. Cleaning, open windows, cleaning places, letting, all that stuff that brought in by nurses and things, people started paying attention. The Navy ships, the hospital ships, that was one of the first places. It was like, there was more open spaces, and this is where they started putting it together. They didn't necessarily connect it to germ theory at the time, but they just realized there were certain things that took place that basically helped the survival rate. But yeah, they didn't accept germ theory until way after the war.
I'm only half remembering this, but there was the thing where the soldiers started to glow, and then the ones that glowed got better faster. I think it was in the south. And
It's Shiloh.
okay.
It was a pond, so in the Battle of Shiloh, there's some soldiers that were left on the field at night because they were kind of in a no man's land sort of thing, and it was in a puddle. And they realized that there was some glowing taking place. And they figured out later that it was some sort of bacteria or this that was the glow that was eating the bad flesh and kind of helped. That's what, in essence, maggots eat dead flesh. So it kind of helps clean the wound. They didn't understand that. But yeah, it caused a glowing, and it was because of the bacteria that was eating in their wounds that was.
About 3 years ago, I watched plenty of TV, and they had a high school kid. He'd heard those stories about that glow, and nobody had ever done this, and so he's like a senior in high school or a junior. And he went to that area and got rooting around, believing, it's a bacteria or something, and found it. Took it and got a gold star for the science class, and they identified that bacteria, which is like, it makes antibiotics of some kind.
Yeah.
Pretty neat.
It was the Battle of Shiloh.
One more.
Okay.
What about leeches? So leeches were, were they helpful? Were
Yes.
they used?
We didn't bring our leeches with us.
Oh, that's true.
Or
yeah.
our hot cupping, the cupping, you go to
Oh,
some kind of
cupping.
thing. Yeah, we've got cups. They use leeches to help try and get blood flowing back through in the wounds. Let's say after an amputation or for different things. So they did use leeches. They were still believing in bloodletting. So often, I think Lincoln even went under a regimen of bloodletting, along with mercury, along with a number of different things. But as you have with large armies, lots of diseases, the food wasn't very good. Vegetables, they had scurvy, vegetables were horrible, so that tended to give them diarrhea or dysentery if they ate it, so they tended not to. The Union Army had more food than the Confederates did. Sometimes the Confederates, on their march to Gettysburg, they would come across a field of green corn, and it was like, we're eating tonight. And so there just wasn't a lot. So that made them malnourished, more susceptible to diseases. And of course, then the treatment at times was, turpentine or mercury or blue moss or something. And then sometimes the treatment was as bad as the actual disease. And large armies, think in terms of 65,000 on one side. Think of the damage it does to communities at Gettysburg, at Sharpsburg, a variety of different places, because they would go out and get food. And the battlefields were horrible. And so the disease not only hit the troops, it also hit sometimes communities with it. Western soldiers coming out of Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they're out in the hinterlands, not interacting with too many people. They got mixed with people from New York or Philadelphia, so smallpox, measles, a variety, you could have all sorts of outbreaks, living together in type tuberculosis, any number of things. But diarrhea and dysentery were the most, killed the most as far as diseases.
Well, along those lines too, we were just civilized enough that if you came out of large areas of New York, you had modern amenities. Then they showed you to Army military camp where you had to go dig a latrine. So even though they'd acted quickly off of the frontier towns into big city living, and they quickly forgot what frontier living would be like, and because of that, they didn't keep a sanitary camp. There's a couple accounts where you'd have guys from like Minnesota camping next to New York. And Minnesota was considered the most western state on the eastern front at that point. They were loggers and farmers and still very much living off the land, so they kept a very clean camp and didn't get sick very often. But when camped next to some of the regiments coming out of New York, they would all get sick because New York was sick, and it would spread through the camps. Anyways, I think that's about all we have for this evening.
Yeah.
You are welcome to come up, look at what we brought, ask questions one-on-one. We have a few more minutes.
Well, thank you, Keith and Ashley, appreciate it.